booked off the night, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll do that. And by the way, I'm recording tonight, and it will be available later on YouTube, so I can get the links out to people if they want to watch it again. I'm remembering a time of great grandparents, grandparents, elderly aunts and uncles who I'd see twice a year when I was a kid, at Christmas and at midsummer family picnics. They were strange yet very lovable beings who'd bring their stories, their laughter, their ability to blow smoke rings, pull nickels out of our ears, their rum and coke cackling and cigarette hacking, their loving cooing and wooing over us kids. At the center of all of these was my grandfather, his older sister, Aunt Ivy, and his two brothers, Uncle Wally and Uncle Len. All of them from jolly old England, with their songs and stories from the good old music hall days, fish and chips wrapped in yesterday's news, and foggy streets of East London. Uncle Len, I remember him standing over us, slightly stooped, ruffling our hair, about to take stage as he did every summer. Kids, he'd say, did I ever tell you about the time we came over on the Titanic? Or was it the Lusitania? Now, Len, teased Aunt Ivy, don't be telling those children your tall tales. Oh, sure, he'd grin. Kids, how about the time I told you? Did I ever tell you about the time I sold shoes? Have I told you this one before? And of course he had. Lots of times. Every summer. And sometimes at Christmas, he'd tell us the story. And we'd pretend that we hadn't heard it before and encourage him to tell us, while the adults simply groaned. See, Uncle Len had sold shoes in a small town store for many years. He enjoyed his work, and he developed good relationships with all his customers. He was a natural salesman, his customers very loyal. Some of them coming to him for years and years, decades. Some brought their children and their grandchildren. One day, an old woman, one of his regular customers, came in looking for a pair of new shoes, a very particular pair. In fact, she had a cutting from a woman's magazine illustrating the very pair that she wanted, a pair of high heels in black, shiny leather. Uncle Len's shop didn't have that particular pair in stock. However, he knew that he could order them and have them in about a week or two, but that would mean she wouldn't get them right away. Or, and he'd always pause at this point, he'd look left and right, and he'd lean in really close for dramatic effect, and he'd say, well, I had seen those shoes across the street in the window of the town's other shoe store. So what did I do? Uncle Len would ask us. And we'd all stare blankly, because we knew that Uncle Len was going to tell us. He said, I could see how badly that woman wanted those shoes. Now, if I tell her where she can get them, if I tell her that she can go across the street, well, she'd appreciate my honesty and my goodwill. And yes, she might buy the shoes from my competitor, but I know that she'll come back to me again in the future because she knows I'm an honest salesman. And so that's what he does. He tells her that she'll find the shoes across the street. The old woman thanks Uncle Len and heads off to buy the shoes. Well, at that point, Uncle Len straightens up and smiles, and he waits for one of us to say, what happened next, Uncle Len? And by now, the adults sitting nearby in their lawn chairs and at picnic tables are guffawing and moaning. Well, says Uncle Len, suddenly there was a screech of brakes and a sickening thud, and he punches his palm for effect. I hear a scream, he says. I run out to see what's happened, and lo and behold, that old lady that I've just been talking to is lying in the street, hit by a car while she was crossing over. I'd sent her. I felt terrible. And at this point, Uncle Len wipes his forehead with his handkerchief and hangs his head, looking very guilty. And then he turns slightly and winks at the laughing adults who are pleading for him to stop. Oh, those poor kids, my grandmother chides. Len, you should know better. Now, I've heard the story many times. I mean, I'm 13 years old, so I've had a long time to hear this story. But at 13, I'm old enough to start wondering about the story's moral implications. I surmise that Uncle Len is suggesting that somehow it was his fault that the woman was hit by the car. But how could he have known that the accident would happen? I mean, wasn't he doing a good deed by telling the woman the truth about where she could find the shoes she was seeking? I mean, certainly she'd be happy and grateful to Uncle Len. And shouldn't she have maybe been more careful crossing the street? Maybe the driver should have been more careful. Who was at fault? Thing is, Uncle Len, he didn't tell us any more. It was always at that point he'd turn and walk away. He wouldn't answer our questions. Did the woman live? Was she dead? Who was at fault? Was it fate? Was it God's fault? To be honest, I never quite figured that story out. But I knew that we'd hear it again next year. And I figured that maybe one day when I was older, I'd understand it. Well, the years passed by.
Everybody's in.
The years passed by. Aunt Ivy and Grandpa, Uncle Wally, they all passed away. Family picnics faded into memory, and as did Uncle Len. But one night the phone rings. It's my brother, Mark. "Remember Uncle Len?" he says. "Yeah, why?" "Well, he's not well. He's in the hospital. He's dying." Mark and I arranged to visit the hospital and pay our regards. When we arrive, Aunt Betty is keeping vigil over her husband. Both of them are in their early 90s. Aunt Betty welcomes us with a hug and an invitation to sit with her. Uncle Len is lying in bed. He's in a coma. He's unconscious. He has been for some time. Death is imminent. Mark asks if it's okay to sit beside Uncle Len. "Well, I don't know if he'll remember you boys," Aunt Betty says. "But if you'd like to sit with him, you're welcome." Mark sits down beside Uncle Len's bed and gently takes his hand. There's no response. It's obvious death is very near now. But still, Mark explains who we are, offers greetings from our other siblings. And then, after a long silence, we ask Uncle Len if he remembers a story that he used to tell us at the family picnics. About the old lady who came in to buy a pair of shoes. And between Mark and I, we retell the story to our comatose uncle. And once again, the story ends with that indeterminable dilemma hanging in the air. Whose fault was it? I ask. Mark and I look at one another. We turn to Aunt Betty. "Don't ask me," she laughs. "I'm just surprised you boys remember the story at all." Just then Mark looks back at Uncle Len and then at me. "What is it?" I ask. He just squeezed my hand." We look back at our unconscious uncle. There are tears on his cheeks. That night, a story, remembered, returned from the distant past, hovered over us before flying deep into the mystery of a dying man. And somewhere in that chasm, it returned, I believe, to his soul, reverberating in that nearly imperceptible squeezing of a hand, a gentle, loving acknowledgement, an expression of gratitude for remembering. And for the first time, I felt as if I finally understood the point of Uncle Len's story. Thank you.